Will the Hall of Fame call finally come for Fred McGriff and Dale Murphy? This is BPTV, Cory McCartney and Grant McAuley with you as always. And Grant, there may never be a better chance for these two former Braves when the contemporary era committee meets Sunday in San Diego.
It sure feels like some stars are aligning for both of these guys. And as we've talked about over the past few weeks since this ballot was announced, really fascinating list of 8 names. I don't know that they could be much more different in some cases. I'm sure we're going to get into that. But as you do look at this ballot and you do look at everything that I think some of these players, many of these players, obviously, if they made it to the era's committees, had to go through on the baseball writers ballot, now to have their hands or their fate in the hands of their peers in large part, should make it pretty interesting to see how this all plays out come Sunday in San Diego.
So McGriff and Murphy are also joined by Albert Bell, Barry Bonds, Roger Clemens, Don Mattingly, Rafael Palmeiro, and Curt Schilling. They'll be judged by a 16-member panel that includes Jack Morris, Ryan Sandberg, Lee Smith, Frank Thomas, Alan Trammell, and a couple of former Braves in Chipper Jones and Greg Maddux. Chipper and Maddox's presence could certainly help these former Braves, but I think it's important to note that candidates still have to receive at least 12 votes from the panel. The committee members can only vote for 3 players, but let's look at this year and why this vote could be different for McGriff and Murphy. And we'll start with McGriff. And why is he potentially getting the call on Sunday night, Grant?
I think that McGriff has just had this great all-around Hall of Fame case that was really, it was quiet excellence for so long. It was consistency as a slugger in an era in which he kind of bridged the gap between the 1980s, which was a decade dominated, not funnily enough, by Dale Murphy, and then getting into the steroid era where I feel like some of McGriff's exploits really started to take a back seat to guys who were hitting 40, 50, 60, 70 home runs in some cases. The guy hitting 30 home runs a year for what felt like a decade and a half somehow had to play second fiddle to a lot of that. And I think that was kind of unfair, but I think that's some of the optics that goes into it. But as you do start to get inside the stats of Fred McGriff's overall candidacy, it's more than just 493 home runs. He has an all-around great case, I feel like, as a consistent slugger in the modern era. And that is where I feel like, you know, some of the baseball Hall of Fame's I'll say shortcomings when it comes to election have really been laid bare. We've looked at and had all this consternation over so many guys for so long as far as, you know, allowing the last 50, 60, 70 years of the game to maybe be properly elevated to Hall of Fame status, much like the first 75 or 80 years of the Hall of Fame really recognized a lot of players. I think Fred McGriff is just one of those guys that really is just a case in point for some of the shortcomings for the way that the election process has gone, particularly over the last 25 or 30 years, as everything has been clouded with the controversy of some PED users. And of course, we look at this 8-man ballot and we see that same cloud is hanging over all of it.
The 7 home runs, though, are interesting because had he gotten to that magical 500 in total, I don't even think we're talking about him waiting to get into the Hall of Fame instead of capping out at 39.8% of the votes when he was on the writers' ballot. But I think this situation, having his contemporaries, the guys who also lived through the strike, only helps McGriff because he was averaging 33 home runs from 1988 to 2002. He had 34 before play stopped in August of 1994, had 27 home runs in 144 games the next year. The guys who played with him and against him know he would have hit 7 more home runs. And then you add in, he's the only player who's not in the Hall of Fame who had 493 home runs, 2,490 hits, and did it without the cloud of PEDs, which I think, you know, factors into everything that we're talking about with this ballot. McGriff, in his first time on the era committee ballot, I think feels as much as a shoo-in as potentially anybody that we're talking about.
Yeah, and looking in those stats just a little bit further, I mean, 493 home runs is tied with Lou Gehrig for 29th all time. If McGriff did hit the 7 more home runs to get to exactly 500, he'd just break the tie with Gehrig. He wouldn't pass anybody else on the home run list, but I went inside the 500 home run club to see how does Fred McGriff, who did hit enough home runs in the postseason, I think, to qualify as a 500 home run club guy, but that's just, you know, my little caveat to it. And I just posted this on Twitter, so be sure to check this out because I'm going to put a few more stats out there as far as Fred McGriff's case is concerned. But an 886 OPS for McGriff, that would be 58th all-time among Hall of Fame hitters. And that might sound way far down the list, but let me throw this at you. He'd be just behind Willie McCovey, just ahead of Eddie Matthews and Harmon Killebrew, and well ahead, like 30-plus percentage points, actually 40 percentage points ahead of Reggie Jackson. Then you find Eddie Murray under that, Ernie Banks under that. The common thread for all those hitters I just mentioned, they're members of the 500 home run club. So when you talk about the excellence over time and, looking at stats just beyond just that number, that home run column, Fred McGriff was an all-around, very well-rounded slugger. And in fact, his on-base percentage is above some of the biggest names of all time, including Hank Aaron. So again, everybody looks a little bit different. I'm not trying to make the case that Fred McGriff is far and away the better player than any of those guys because he's ahead of them in one category or another. But as you start to look just across the slash lines and across some of the other slugging exploits of Fred McGriff, he stacks up favorably as, at worst, an average Hall of Famer. And when we're talking about an average Hall of Famer, let me point this out, that is an extremely good baseball player, top 1% that have ever played. And I just believe that Fred McGriff should be on that list. He did it extremely well for a long time. And as you pointed out, Corey, there's something to be said for the way that he did it, which is something we're probably going to talk about again in a moment.
Yeah, this is the first time for McGriff, who's on the era committee ballots, but this is the third time for Dale Murphy. He did not get in 2018. He did not get in 2020. I know you and I, both in our talks with Dale, know how much this would mean to him. Why is this year going to be different?
I really hope that this year is going to be different. And it's something we talked about on From the Diamond this past week is that, it feels as much as anything like a candidate like a Fred McGriff, a Dale Murphy, a Don Mattingly, they're kind of being stacked against perhaps the PED users on this ballot because you have three of the biggest known names that have been linked to performance-enhancing drugs, either by failing a test or by being indicted or having some other legal proceeding following them around for a number of years, and Barry Bonds, Roger Clemens, and Rafael Palmeiro. You've got a couple of other characters on this ballot that I'll say unsavory might be the word for him. We know how surly Albert Bell was over the course of his career. And then, of course, Curt Schilling became a very divisive character on the baseball writers ballot over the past 5 or 6 years. Now, putting all of that aside and just focusing in on Dale Murphy, I feel like, and this is just, and call me a big haul guy if you want to, but if you're in the conversation as the best player in baseball for the better part of a decade, I feel like you have a place in the Hall of Fame. And while we'll look at numbers and while some of these numbers are automatic locks for the Hall of Fame, I do feel like cases are different for different players. And if we're going to sit around and moralize and police the members of the Hall of Fame and use this character clause to keep guys out, I think that the character clause should count for something for someone who has been one of baseball's best humanitarians, best ambassadors, and, oh, by the way, has 2 MVP awards, is a 7-time All-Star with 5 Gold Gloves and 4 Silver Sluggers, and is just one of the best players of an entire decade. In fact, he led baseball in total bases in the 1980s, and there were some pretty good sluggers playing at that time. So I say all that to say this. Dale Murphy's case has not changed since the day he retired, but I think the lens in which we look at baseball, slugging, and overall hitter and offensive numbers has changed drastically since Dale Murphy had his last at-bat in 1993.
Okay, so going off that, and I'm not going to harp on the inclusion of Harold Baines and say just because you put him in means that you now need to put Dale Murphy in. But I think having Baines in allows you to look at guys in a different light, and I think that should be the case with someone like Dale Murphy. He hit more home runs despite Baines playing in 650 more games. He beat him in Fangraph War. And when you talk about helping to define a decade, as you did, in the 80s, Murphy ranked 12th in Fangraph War, and every player that's in front of him and 5 players that are behind him in that decade are already in Cooperstown. So I think, too, all the negativity around so many other people on this ballot, I think that puts him in a better light. Character obviously matters on the writer's ballot. If it matters here, I think that's ultimately what I do think is going to get Murphy elevated. But I want to go back to that inclusion of Bain because, I think he's obviously considered a curious case to get into the Hall, but I think he has seemingly impacted things because a year after he was elected, Ted Simmons, who didn't even make it past his first year on the ballot in 1994, was rejected 7 times in his attempts in the era committee. He got in. And the last time that those groups met, they put in 4 players, which is the most that they've done since 1971. So I think this kind of sense that there's gatekeepers to the approach, I think that might be ending, and that ultimately might be helping out in a case like McGriff and Murphy.
I hope that it is. I mean, we talked about time and again the case that Tim Raines had in trying to get in and finally getting in his last year on the ballot. And he's not alone with guys who see a surge from a very low opening, I guess, vote total, if you call that, or low percentage. But the ballot was so crowded for so long. If anything, I looked at the baseball writers ballot this year and thought, wow, I mean, can you get to 10? I can get to 10, but will everybody get to 10? Probably not. But there's at least half a dozen guys on there that I think will get a fresher and more serious and deeper dive into what they accomplished, because you're not sitting around talking about the best power pitcher of the modern era, save Nolan Ryan and Roger Clemens, and baseball's all-time home run leader, both of which could not get into the Hall of Fame because of their own issues and their own problems, which again are not the focus of this whole conversation. But to make a long story short, I think these revamped eras committees are a good thing. I'm hoping that, and I know that the way that we look at statistics, analytics, and ways of finding player value have gone far beyond, well, he's a such and such hitter with this many homers and this many RBI. I mean, that's a great way to look at somebody in a very quick cursory glance of what kind of power hitter, what kind of slugger is he. But in the case of Murphy, the stolen bases, the gold gloves, those are things that I think are important. He's a catcher that turned himself into an all-star gold glove center fielder. Go ahead and go down the list and see how many of those you find for me in the Hall of Fame. A back-to-back MVP, that's usually a pretty good caveat or a pretty good line on a resume as well. And I think that those are the kind of things, those kind of accolades are things that his contemporaries can certainly see because they played against him. And analytically speaking, for maybe Fred McGriff and a lot of other players, including maybe Andrew Jones on the baseball writers ballot, Scott Rowland, some of these other guys, they're going to be looked at a little bit more favorably, or at least a little deeper, a little bit more of a look under the hood at what their case actually is, rather than saying, well, this guy only hit 254 and he didn't play for long enough. His peak wasn't for long enough, whatever the case was. Dale Murphy had a debilitating knee injury, and that cost him the final couple of 3 years of his career, I would say. He also went through a player strike in 1981 that cost him 55 games. If he gets to 400 home runs, which, by the way, is 2 more, are we having this conversation? Would he have been voted in the late 90s? Does it matter that he went on the ballot for the first time, along with George Brett, Nolan Ryan, and Robin Yount, all guys that got voted in the very first year of eligibility? There are so many different layers to this, and I know I've been talking for a long time, so I want to throw it back to you, but I'm just really fascinated by the processes, and I'm very hopeful that Dale Murphy's case will continue to get looked at until the time people finally realize what they should have years and years ago.
Well, Braves fans collectively have their fingers crossed as the Atlanta wing in Cooperstown could potentially get even bigger. And don't forget, we've got you covered with all things Braves this winter. So subscribe, turn on notifications, and make sure you tell a friend. And don't forget that you can find us on From the Diamond wherever you find your podcast. Until next time, I'm Cory McCartney. He's Grant McAuley, and we'll see you soon, Braves country.